General Fogelman was the 15th Chief of Staff of the Air Force and also served as Misty 86, and he served under command of General McPeak. General Fogelman.
Well, I have been assigned that portion of the presentation to talk about the difference between flying in the South and flying up north. And as a little bit of backdrop, at that time in Vietnam, we had 4 F-100 wings. We had the largest concentration of F-100s you could have. So we were at Phuket, Tuy Hoa, Phan Rang, and Bien Hoa. So generally 3 squadrons per wing, except at Bien Hoa we only had 2, right? And the other one was an A-37 squadron. And generally, each squadron had 1 person volunteer to be at Misty, TDY to Phuket. And then the Phuket guys made up the other half. And that brought you, at any given time, to somewhere around 17 to 19 pilots. Now, General McPeak and I, Tony and I we remember this differently in terms of how we got everybody there, but you had to volunteer and you went up there. I was assigned to the 510th Buzzards of Bien Hoa, volunteered to go up, got up there in December of '68. I flew 80 missions and returned in April, went back to my squadron in April of '69. We had collected just about all the F-100Fs because we all flew in the 2-seaters up there. Each squadron back in the wings normally had 1 F for checkout. And the biggest difference was that in terms of the kind of flying is down south, our primary mission was close air support. And so we were flying primarily with 500-pound bombs, 750-pound bombs, napalm, and some rocket pods. When you went to Misty, there were a couple of things that happened. They took the inboard pylons off the airplane. You flew with 2 drop tanks, and you had these Lao rocket pods on the outboard stations, 7 rockets per pod. And in addition to the different ordnance, the threat was considerably different. In the South, we were doing close air support, and the primary threat came from small arms and also from some medium cal stuff. You had 12.7 and 14.5, 50 cal kind of things down south. In fact, I got shot down south with 50 cal kind of weapon. Up north, as has already been pointed out, you were generally facing 23 millimeter, 37 millimeter, 57, and 85, and some SAMs over in the route pack, and then later the shoulder-fired missiles. And this change in the threat led to a very interesting transition training, if you will. Now, it's already been described how in the course of your tour, you alternated back seat, front seat. But when you first went to Misty, your first 5 missions were in the back seat. And on one of those missions, you got training on identifying AAA. And believe it or not, we had training aids that we never killed. These were gunners that were so bad that we sort of had a truce, you know, and so because they couldn't hit us, we would leave them alone. They were very valuable. And so you would, you'd take a guy up on his first ride and you'd say, okay, this is threat identification day. First thing I'm going to show you is a 23 millimeter. Now, the thing you got to remember about 23 millimeters, twin barrel, fire a lot of rounds at you, and about every 25 rounds, there's an accumulation of cordite in the end of the barrels, and it ignites. And so 23 millimeter gun sights are self-marking. Don't waste marking rockets on them because they have this puff of smoke that comes up every now and then, so you can just tell the guys where the 23 is. Okay, and so you'd go by and let some guy hammer at you, and then you'd pull up. See all that? Yeah, got it. Okay. Then you get down and say, okay, we're going to go look at a 37 millimeter now. 37 millimeters fire 5-round clips, and they kind of look like softballs coming at you, orange softballs, just, you know, and they would come at you just like that. You go through, okay, happy with that? Yeah, I got it. Okay, I got that one. And that's the way you would go through this, you know, exercise and orient people. And it was, sometimes it was very exciting because while we had our training aides, some guys who weren't part of the training aid, you know, brigade from North Vietnam would sneak somebody else in, you know, and so you'd be up there looping around, looking down at some training aid, and you'd hear one of these things smack, and as they went by, supersonic, they didn't have to hit the airplane. I mean, they would make a hell of a sound, and it was one of those, sweet Jesus, what was that sort of thing, you know, which was always an unannounced thing. So that was basically it. We normally flew 7 sorties a day, or we started to later on. The call signs were Misty 1-1 through Misty 7-1 at the end of the day. And you talked about technology. By the time I was there, 68, 69, we still were using the handheld 35 millimeter cameras as our primary documentation device, intel gathering device. But the most lucrative missions of the day were Misty 1-1, just at sunrise, and Misty 6-1, 7-1 at the end of the day. Because I think that the North Vietnamese had a productivity chart, you know, tons moved south and all this kind of stuff. And the local sector guys were always trying to get on the road before dark, and so they'd get out there and you could catch them and hammer those guys. And then in the morning, it was kind of detective work. There were lots of river crossings. And so you go up there in the morning mission, and you would start maybe down in the south, and you would see which side of the ford was water splashed up on. And if it was on the south side, you knew they had moved somewhere south. And he just kept going down to where there was no more water being splashed up on the south side. And that way you knew somewhere in between there was a truck park. And that's when you put the Misty eyes to work, and that's kind of how we worked it. And then, believe it or not, while Tony was the commander, you know, he's always a front-leading, high-tech guy, they introduced handheld night vision things. Remember those things, Tony? They weighed about 40 pounds. You got there in the back seat, you'd mount that sumbitch, and the way you survived in Misty is you never had less than 4 Gs on the airplane, you know, so we were building some real bodybuilders back there trying to hold this thing up. And in the end, they didn't prove to be real successful, but this is the kind of stuff that literally led to the development of things like the Lantern Pod and things of that nature. In my view, one of the real untold stories coming out of Vietnam, just not out of Misty, is what the Air Force leadership, of which I was not part of, Tony wasn't part of in that time, so I'm not pumping ourselves, but the guys who were around in the late 70s and in the early 80s who took to heart the lessons we learned in Vietnam. And from an air power perspective, it was you must deny the enemy sanctuaries. And the sanctuaries that the enemy had were, some were political, some were night, some was foliage, some was weather. And so what happened in the late 70s and the early 80s is the leadership and the technological base in this country started taking those sanctuaries away. And the greatest sanctuary they had was integrated air defense. And that eventually led to different kinds of pods, led to stealth. So there was a lot of stuff came out of this. I went back down to Benoit, stayed down there beyond my DROS, and then eventually, like PK, I went back, flew an F4 tour where I put my Misty work together and ended up being the commander of the Laredo FAC over there. So anyway, it was a great group of people. We were all there because we wanted to be there, and I've never been part of anything that was closer in terms of thought process, etc. You read the book, you'll see that it was, it turned out to be an extraordinary group of people, not because we were extraordinary people, but because of what we believed in and the people who did it. You know, flag officers is not a measure of merit, but we had our fair share of flag officers, a couple of astronauts, some guy who flies around the world unrefueled for the first time, etc. He tried to do that a couple of times at Misty too, but it wasn't, you know, so that's my story. I was 26 years old, had a flat belly, and I was invincible. And so I wasn't all wrapped up in all the political hookah-book and all that. I mean, it was going on. You understood that. It was only later in life when you started to read and you ran across books like Dereliction of Duty and things like that, you figured out what was really going on back here in Washington, and particularly by the leadership of the services who should have been standing up to guys like McNamara, but didn't. And so that was a sort of a lesson that I took away. I never expected to be somebody, but in my mind I figured out if I ever were somebody, I was going to do my job, and if they didn't like me, then it's tough. So I guess that was the thing I learned out of it. Didn't learn much while I was there, but look back.